aspects, sexy aspects or not so sexy aspects, and then you pull on it and you start to examine and dive deeper, and then you receive the gift of finding out more.
I heard you say once that we are not just a brain with a body, but we are a body with a brain, which I absolutely love, because as a student and a researcher of the nervous system, I never think about the brain as its own isolated thing. I think about the nervous system and the fact that the brain and the spinal cord are connected to the body, and the body is connected to this to the brain in every direction. It's everything truly is connected at the physical level, physiological level. Could you just share for a moment how you think about this body-brain relationship in terms of, you mentioned movement of emotions, movement of the body, that you can't really separate the two. And for the typical person who's listening to this, they might not immediately understand what that means. Maybe it's something that has to be experienced. But when we think about the body and the brain and the whole thing working as one cohesive whole, what does that mean to you? Or put simply, when you do a movement practice, what are you focusing on? Are you focusing on the movement of your limbs? I have to imagine that's true, but are you also focusing on how that makes you feel, or how your feelings make you move?
Okay. Okay, so some thoughts. I will try not to answer any of your questions during this interview, but I will definitely give some thoughts, and then we can play with it. I think these definitions and in general the limitation of words ends up creating some kind of a corruptive process. The words corrupt us and corrupt our understanding. So I think the brain, body, this Cartesian state of mind and thinking brought a lot of good, but also brought a lot of problems.
Halfway there.
And movement for me is the entity that ties everything together. It's the magic. It's the forza anima. It's when the coin spins and you see both sides appear at the same time. It's a beautiful analogy from a friend of mine, Dr. Rasmus Olme.
10 seconds.
So the mind and body are one of those pairs, and I call it the movement body-mind system. When it's integrated, it's in motion. There is also a stillness that appears there, of course. Without it, there can be no motion, but maybe that is a very good way to start to think of things. There is no really pure mental processes, cognitive processes. There is no pure physical processes. Everything touches everything. There is a wholeness, and that wholeness is in motion. The movement practice
halfway there
takes these beats and examine them. And here is a pragmatic thing. The scientist, the cerebral thinking about movement. This is important. The emotional side, coloring, feeling the colors and the textures of motion. A lot of people who are involved with a movement practice never end up feeling motions, really focusing on how it makes you feel or how it feels itself. And then the actual movement, the action. So it's action, emotion, and thought. And those are three streams of movement, and they interlace together into this kind of a braided experience, and whole experience. And I try to bring all these aspects into my practice and the way that I live my life.
I think most people who embark on a movement practice will first want to know which movements to do.
Halfway there.
Squats, planks, push-ups, pirouettes, right? Pick your movement. It could be any movement. Are there any sort of just basic entry points that you believe everybody should walk through as they embrace a movement practice? The first
10
time,
seconds.
and maybe even every time they do a movement practice. Earlier today, I had the great privilege of being guided through a long series of movement practices. And yet the first practice we did involved, at first anyway, stillness, not movement. So if you would, could you inform us, how people should think about approaching a movement practice? What is the first layer of any good movement practice?
So you touch the word movements, and it's important for me to separate it from the word movement with a capital M. Movements are the containers, and movement
Halfway
is
there.
the content. And the content cannot be carried in any way without containers. So the first entry point is to choose containers. And then the second thing to make sure is to put specific content into those containers and then enjoy them. I tell people that
10
it's like a
seconds.
cup of water, and you're being handed that cup of water. And nowadays, very often, people will start to chew on the cup instead of drinking the water, making it yours, discard the cup. And then maybe later you want to have bone broth or soup, so you use a different container, a bowl. So a movement practice can start from anywhere. It's a rhizome. It's an open system. It has no center. It's decentralized, and it can be approached from anywhere. And that's its magic, and that's the benefit of it. Some people find the body a good entry point. Some people don't even enter from the body.
Halfway there.
Sometimes you can enter from other perspectives, and then inside the body, for example. Where should we enter if we decided to take the body approach? The spine can be a nice decision, but some will choose just the pelvis. Any one of those points are valid, and then playfulness can be an entry
10
point,
seconds.
an attribute, and this is so open. So I don't want to limit people and limit their minds in the way that they engage with a practice, but I also want to encourage the self-inquiry. Am I doing movements practice, or am I doing a movement practice?
So could you help me distinguish the two a little bit further? I think I understand the difference between a sort of the noun versus the verbs. And in some ways, here we are dealing with the challenge of, the barriers that language present to something that's physical, right? I mean, indeed, there may not be
Halfway there.
There is no perfect verbal language for movement. There are certain movements that defy language. I could say somebody jumped at a particular trajectory at a particular speed and moved this limb and that limb, but by fractionating it, something is most definitely lost. So if someone wanted to, let's say, get
10
in
seconds.
better touch with their body, in quotes, in order to explore the infinite space that is movement, how might they begin to approach that? Does it begin with an awareness, with practice, or both?
It begins with education. And that's probably the most stable point of entry, awareness to something as a concept, that it is a concept, that there is a validity, or because sometimes people look for that, to looking at this entity, this open entity. And that's part of the reason why answering questions is not
Halfway
something
there.
I can do or even attempt to do. I believe in the power of the non-complete process, like making this table, but leaving something undone, not perfecting the product. Why? Because it offers some kind of a dynamic nature of
10
evolution that
seconds.
naturally unravels from it. And almost like sometimes I do it, I count reps and I'll only count to 9. Because it tends to leave people in the count, and it keeps going instead of giving them the 10.
Everyone wants to end on 10.
Yeah, which is because of the decimal system. So all kinds of things like that is also important with the movement idea, is to discuss, to examine, to look, to taste, to try, and then also not to try to capture, because if you, like the invisible loop of Hofstadt, if you look at it too closely, it's gone. But if you look away, it functions and exists just like us, very powerfully, and obviously gives us the experiences that we have. So when people enter movement practice, it is about education, bringing some awareness to the fact that they are living in a body, that they are living in motion, that their mind is a type of movement, that their life is a type of movement, bringing attention to the movement of the emotions as well, bringing just attention to the fact that things are in motion. The Euryclitus Pantarei, all in flux. Nothing stops besides something that is the background of it and allows it to express. And this is the beauty of things. And this for me is the movement practice, is this examination and bringing this awareness
Halfway
into
there.
things. As we sit now here, I'm also aware of my body. I'm also aware of the way that things make me feel, the way that your face is communicating to me, and I'm not just in some limited and very verbal, overly verbal state.
10
because
seconds.
It misses a lot of the beautiful flux.
I'm going to inject some or project some ideas, and perhaps you would tell me if they're ridiculous, potentially useful, or useful. As I understand what we're talking about now and what we've discussed earlier is that movement can and should be incorporated into one's entire life. I've even heard you say that even before getting out of bed in the morning, one can experience movement, and it doesn't necessarily have to be of the intimate kind with somebody else. It can be paying attention to the rhythm of one's breath, or how you get out of the bed, or actually in anticipation of you arriving
Halfway
here today,
there.
I noticed that as I was going up and down the stairs in this house, that I was injecting a little bit of playfulness in the way that I might have many, many decades ago, but haven't for a very long time. And I asked myself whether or not that's what ego is referring to when he talks about threading
10
this
seconds.
body awareness throughout the day, as opposed to, but of course not exclusive from, just saying, I have 45 minutes, I'm going to do movement practice before I shower and have some dinner. Right? I have to imagine both are helpful, but in terms of moving through the day and having bodily awareness, clearly there are an infinite number of ways one could do that. Maybe you could just share a few. You mentioned, one could pay attention to their breath, pay attention to posture, and this notion of play is a very attractive, or as we say in science, it's a sticky concept, a concept that kind of draws one in. Maybe if you would, could you share with us just some ideas to get people thinking about, or maybe even incorporating movement practice
Halfway
into
there.
their day, and even touch on the potential role of play or playfulness.
Okay. Yeah, those are some good directions. I think one thing is this, what you call wordlessness. I have been
10
recommending to
seconds.
people non-verbal experiences and the awareness of the body, which is not really the awareness of the body, as you know, not purely or not fully. The awareness of motion is a very good way to start, to bring awareness to that layer. And that layer will start to get clarified more and more and more the more you practice. And then it will enable for most people a safe haven away from many states and difficulties, and will unlock a lot of potential attributes and strengths and freshness and a lot of beautiful things.
Halfway there.
Really, one of the real perspectives about who we are comes from a person who influenced my thinking a lot, Moshe Feldenkrais, the late Moshe Feldenkrais. And he talks about the body as the core, 3 elements, the core nervous system. 2 is the
10 seconds.
mechanical system of muscle, skeleton, etc. And the 3rd is the environment, which is a unique way to look at it. And he talks about how the nervous system is both receiving information from the outside and from the inside. And in the first years of life, you work a lot on differentiating those, what is me and what is not me. And I think movement, when you feel movement, you feel the movement of the outside that is, of course, arriving to you and receiving this, and also your own internal movement. And the same can be said for stillness. So bringing
Halfway
the
there.
attention into those layers, it's a tricky thing. It's one of those elusive things to look at, but it's definitely of huge benefit to start to train it, start to practice it, to feel not our thoughts, not necessarily our body, but to start
10
to
seconds.
recognize the dynamic nature, the flux, the motion, and it occurs in all these layers. So you will need to find it in multiple locations before you start to more and more make it your own, make it really yours. How? For example, simple pragmatic things. I used to do this. I spent some time in Hong Kong. Would need to get my practice in, but I'm really turned off from commercial gyms, and there is not a lot of nature accessible there. So I would just strap on my bag and I would walk the streets of Hong Kong, which are very crowded.
Halfway there.
And then I would try to avoid touching anyone. And it would be like 2 hours of just like fully involved, fully in my body and experiencing beautiful things and enjoying and developing myself as well in all kinds of scenarios, up and down and in the escalators and off.
10 seconds.
So this is an example of a way to practice. And then the way that we're sitting, like these chairs, for example, our chairs are not very dynamic, but there is rocking chairs, right? And this is something I recommend for a lot of kids. Like in schools, I used to rock on the chair, which is very common.
Yeah, I used to have my skateboard underneath my chair and roll it back and forth, and the teacher would tell me to stop. And I just slowly, little by little, trying to get the most subtle movement I could without them telling me they were going to take it away.
Which is probably horrible advice and instruction. Just like sit up straight and chew with your mouth closed.
Halfway
They
there.
remove a lot of the self-education and a lot of the self-development and the practical discoveries that are necessary and even will damage focus and thinking processes in some ways. So, for example, I would
10
make the
seconds.
chairs even more mobile. And I would support more motion, and then I would be able to bring attention there, but I would also be able to bring attention away from it into other things, and it keeps refreshing me, so I don't become stale. The water doesn't stand. This is the beauty of movement. So you can focus for long periods of time and do incredible things with the mind, with focus, with awareness, attention, and it's with skin in the game. So I'm not talking as some meditator and he's describing the act of being very focused, but then I put a stick on the edge of his fingers and I tell him balance it. Everyone can do
Halfway
it for
there.
10 seconds, and I tell him, okay, now hold it 10 minutes. And you see that the skill he has no skin in the game. It wasn't developed in various scenarios, but so there is a delusion that starts to develop. And that's how movement keeps me very honest
10
and
seconds.
humble in the way that I view humility and in a way that protects me and keeps me fresh.
I love the example of moving through the crowded street with a backpack because of the way in which it's completely adaptive to the situation you happen to be in, and highlights the fact that one doesn't need a gym or any specific scenario. Although we will certainly touch on ideal learning circumstances for movement and some of the work that you're doing, of course.
The less of your own personal practice and understanding and knowledge you've done, the more toys you need. The more you've really worked on yourself, the more high-tech you are. The more low-tech are your tools, the more high-tech you are. And this is the most advanced technology by far on this planet. With all
10
the advancement, it doesn't even start to scratch, and you know it from the way that we understand the eyes, all the way to, with all the respect to the Boston Robotics, a 5-year-old motion movements, or animal motion with very underdeveloped, still relatively to us, systems. So important to remind ourselves.
A lot can be done with the body and gravity.
A piece of floor, a piece of wall, a corner of a room is a beautiful scenario which you can discover in and play in, but we are not so developed, so we don't see those options. And this is something that I try to stimulate, and that's why I made it a point to avoid any of the big sponsorship and high-tech tools. And I on point brought a stick into big conventions and
10 seconds.
Sometimes I use a shirt with holes in it, that just like a used shirt, as a point to make when I'm addressing a crowd, to keep things where it's important. And it's important, we are important, and our experience is important. And we have to be very careful. These habits and these directions, they come from many times good intention, but they are the devil many times. They turn into the devil, just like our technology nowadays and what is happening with people, with depression, with meaninglessness.
Halfway there.
Also with the body in various perspectives, or even I will also flip it into high performance sports and their price, because for me this is not a movement practice. It erases the person in the center of it. And then came places like skateboarding
10
or
seconds.
breakdancing, or somebody with a disability becomes the best in the world, turns it into the biggest advantage, but he would never be accepted into gymnastics club.
Last
And I
round.
love that. And that change, to place change in the center, it's important.
You touched on the mention of a few sports. Maybe it was Charles Poliquin, or maybe it was another trainer that I heard once say that, for kids, one of the worst things they can do is over specialize in a particular sport. The idea being that it leads to improvements in performance in a very
Halfway
narrow
there.
domain, but they raised the idea that it could perhaps also constrains the development of the nervous system, such that certain emotional states or certain intellectual abilities will forever be shut off because of the intense plasticity that occurs early in life. The more I learn from
10
you,
seconds.
the more I'm thinking that that statement really should be extended to all of life. And I love to remind people, because I started off as a developmental neurobiologist, that development
Well
doesn't
done.
start and end. You don't have childhood and adulthood. Our life is one long developmental arc from birth until death, however long that might be. So if one is going to be anti-specialist, maybe even call that a generalist, what does that look like? What are the different domains of movement practice? And as I ask this, I realize I am in serious danger of fractionating movement into a list of words like strength and speed and explosiveness and suppleness, a word that I've heard you use before. And yet I think for most people, because we think in words often, some of those categories can be useful. So let's say I was going to embark on a movement practice, or a child was going to embark on a movement practice, and either throughout the day or for a dedicated period of time. What are the sorts of categories of movement that I might want to think about? Ballistic movement, smooth movement. Maybe you could just enrich us with some of the landscape around that.
Okay, first I'll address the first part that you mentioned, and I've learned from you about certain changes in the way that things develop later in life versus earlier in life. And you're right, this was something that Charles Poliquin also mentioned, and I learned from back in the day as well from him, which can seem dark a bit and kind of hopeless, but then you should go beyond that. One thing that does seem to appear for me when I look around is the concepts of unique postures. And I think this is true for postures of thought, emotional postures, and movement postures. Truly, earlier in life, we are creating these unique postures, and they get into these drawers, or like a language, letters. Later in life, the process moves more towards integration of these unique postures into all different organizations. The beauty of it is that you can use very few postures to create many possibilities. Just like a Leibniz search for a language that contained one symbol only versus two, which he discovered. And this is something that is often seen. Like, you take someone who moves in a certain way and you teach him all these new sports or techniques, but essentially, if you look deeply and you're sensitive, you see it's the same postures that he will have to work with till the end of his life. The same thinking postures. And this is really problematic, where we are not freeing the mind beyond this, how would I say, a scaffolding of thinking, and we are actually letting go of the content. We get more and more focused on the way the way of thinking versus the thinking itself, or habitual ways and forms of thinking, associative thinking, etc. And emotionally the same. We are constructing these emotional postures, and then we have to go through the rest of our lives working with that. So this is the dark side. But of course, there are always possibilities, and both, I think, invading this early system to some extent, even if it's 5% or 7% or whatever percent. And also on the freeing yourself of going beyond all postures, period. Working with the postures you have, but towards a postureless way of doing things. So this is something interesting to work when people work with movements, but finally are able to go into movement, and this magic starts to happen, and then the techniques fall apart and something appears, and it's a phase change. It's a transformation. It's not a it's a binary moment. There is a jump there for sure, and it's very rare to see, both in thinking and emotionally and in other ways. We have many names for it, and some talk about enlightenment and some talk about all kind of processes related to it, and I think most of them are shadows of the sun, but it's not the sun itself really. And then talking about ways of thinking about movement, this is where I use something I call my slice and dice. Because of the problem of using words and definitions and categories, I try to create a lot of them. And I write them on the paper, and then I crumble them, throw them into the bin. And I keep doing it all my life. The writing them down and the geeking on it is very important. Also very important to let it go. I tell people, what you forgot is not the same. Forgetting is not the same as never knowing it. The crumbling and throwing away is a form of forgetting, but it leaves some kind of a homeopathic trace behind. So let's take some slice and dice and try to look at it. Here is a physical one: contraction, relaxation. That's a spectrum. And pretty much everything falls on this spectrum. Also, in terms of analyzing a person or yourself, you can tell me if you feel closer to this side or closer to that side. And then it allows you to examine your practices. How many of the practices are moving you towards balance? And how many are it's your addiction of just doing what you're good at versus what you need? Here's another example: physical culture. So we have the dance realm, working with internal concepts and expressing them, abstract concepts, expression. Second perspective, the martial concept, but not in the sense of just fighting, but also partnering, working with another person, a dynamic entity that is communicating with you. The third one is I call the elements, working with the environment. The next one is a somatic one, is the internal practice. And of course, they are all gray zones. And another one is object manipulatory, which you can think of it also as the environment, but it's more small objects, heavy objects, many objects, few objects. And then you can look at this way of thinking, and you can say, oh, I have many of my practices in this direction, but not, and you can draw it for yourself. So that's another perspective. And this way I use dozens of perspectives, and with the years it gives people a sense of where they want to go, how they want to do it, and what they need to address versus what they like to address itself. Is it helpful?
Very helpful. Those different bins are very helpful. I really appreciate that you mentioned that people will often practice what they're good at as opposed to what they need. In gym culture, we refer to this as the guy that always skips leg day person, right? You know, big upper body, skinny legs, or you'll see people that have these enormous thick torsos and they're bench pressing all day, but they clearly need to pull on an object every once in a while to create some balance, but they don't do it because they, for whatever reason, they have an obsession with moving greater and greater poundage or something like that. Which in certain sports like powerlifting, where aesthetics aren't the goal and it's simply to push more weight off one's chest, you could imagine that there's something beneficial there. However, I think that it's really important in intellectual endeavors and in movement endeavors, if I understand correctly, to bring oneself to a place of real challenge on a regular basis. In fact, earlier today, I was in a state of constant challenge because it was all new to me. And as much as I told myself, beginner's mind, beginner's mind, beginner's mind, it's hard, I confess, to not want to do well, to perform well.
Not only natural, it is necessary. But I want you to keep it on that side and to bring something to balance it. If there is not this challenge, the process will not work. It has to be this scale, and you're talking about scales of pain, pleasure, and this is another scale. Then this discomfort, again, is necessary and should be recognized as I'm in the right place. When it becomes too high and I'm unable to resolve, to make any progress, I went overboard. But when it's not present, I don't do nothing here, nothing that I'm truly interested in. I'm just gratifying myself. Wankery. It's, in essence, it's not about searching for the discomfort, but it's a marker. And I think the question should be, who am I serving? Because people do not serve themselves in essence. They serve parts of it, some kind of a fraction of themselves. And this separation of oneself from oneself, and this is also a result of the practice, a good practice. I think maybe the biggest gift I received from the practice is I can say, although it will take maybe a certain context, I'm not my friend. At times I am, but many times I'm not my friend. And by creating this separation, I can assume a certain stability in the face of everything, all the way up to our own mortality and death, which is, and maybe beyond, who knows.
It was a striking moment for me earlier today when I was really challenged with one of the practices we were doing, and you said, this is exactly what I experienced this morning, Andrew. That's what you said. I couldn't imagine that you were having challenges doing what I was attempting to do, and of course you weren't. What I believe what you were referring to is that you had put yourself at that edge earlier in the day in which you were making failures. You were failing to execute the way that you were attempting to execute movement. I should just, to inject some neuroscience and neuroplasticity there, I can't help myself. This is what I do after all. There are beautiful data in animals and humans showing that in the seconds and minutes after a failed attempt at a motor execution of something, the forebrain is in a heightened state of focus. And when you hear it, it suddenly makes perfect sense. Of course, why would the nervous system change unless it got a cue to change? And the cue almost always comes in the form of frustration. Or as we said earlier, nah. The nah signal is the one that preps you to extract more learning from the subsequent trials. And yet for a lot of people, they feel that failure to execute or even to approximate execution, and they feel and experience the negative signal, and they lean out of the practice. They start to depart either mentally or physically or both. And if there's anything I think that perhaps we can offer is this understanding that edge, as some people call it, or that failures aren't just necessary, they are part of the learning process. They are the entry gate to neuroplasticity.
Yes, contextualizing or recontextualizing that sensation is something I work a lot with, and I just reminded people, and I also reminded to myself. And if it wasn't difficult and we didn't need to redo it again and again, we wouldn't be again on the correct scale, which is dynamic and moving, just like rolling downhill. So the reason There is definitely a necessity to succeed, to orient. There is certain aspects that you want to achieve, but then there is also the letting go of it and the de-ambitioning of it. And within that tension, the plus and the minus comes movement. And that's how again, if I stretch it too far away, or if I increase one of them too much, then I would have some issues. But you will, with practice, learn to recognize the optimal point of progression. Of course, it takes many years and a lot of play and exposure to get a sense of it, regardless of the layer in which it is applied. So I'm sure in your field and in your pursuits, you are already aware of it and applying it in your life, talking about focus, talking about ways of thinking, creativity, etc. But then it's enough that I pull into another perspective, and you will see that people are specialists, and then they don't have really the real essence of the concept. It's not theirs. It's applied specifically. The one who changes all the time gets the general component, because what appears when everything changes, that is the new entity. Everything changes, something stays. That's what we want to get, this concept and this understanding.
I've heard the statement before, we are just a meat vehicle, right? We're just a sack of cells, and it's and I truly despise that statement, because first of all, it deprives us of all meaning of our lives, and we can go down the route of philosophy as to whether or not there's meaning or not, but more importantly, it divorces us from the idea that the body and brain are interconnected and have at least equal value at any one moment. They're informing each other. Emotions inform movement, movement informs emotions. One thing that I've heard you say before, and I'd really love to hear you embellish on, is this important principle that human beings are truly unique in terms of the enormous range of movements that we can perform. And yet we are excellent, maybe superior to all other species at certain types of movement. The one that comes to mind is walking, striding. So maybe we could just explore that idea, because obviously a cheetah is very fast. The gibbon seems to have a lot of proficiency at grabbing and swinging from branches. But human beings perform an enormous, or can potentially perform an enormous array of movements. Do you think all human beings are potentially able to explore all the different types of movement? And if so, how does one approach that? So basically what I'm doing is I'm tabling a concept which is not range of motion, right? For the gym rats, discard with range of motion. I'm talking about the variety of movements.
First, it's not important what I think, if it's possible or not possible, or if it's even possible for you or not possible for you. What is important is what you truly want to do, what you truly are after. And it's important for me because many times this way of thinking about things is already limited. I like to say, a man doesn't go to the ocean to empty it with a spoon. A lot of the types of dressing up of the concepts nowadays is trying to fit an elephant into the hole in the needle. Yeah? Like, for example, the concept of practice, and then our lives, as if we have a life. We have some kind of a stream of behaviors. We have, there is the argument of free will, etc. There is a multiplicity. Definitely, a man is a legion. That's the real meaning of that phrase. One day you wake up like this, I say, Andrew, let's meet tomorrow at 7 a.m., but I don't know who's going to wake up tomorrow. And then you send me a text message, oh, I'm feeling off, right? At 6:55 and go back to sleep. So examining that and seeing that, I think, frees you up eventually and start to orient you in a better direction. So what do you want to do, and but in the orientation of also what you need to do, what you sense, and what you are developing as a evolutionary direction for you. this is the important bit. Is it possible for everyone to engage in certain specific physical movement? For example, in Scandinavian countries, the squat is not very approachable. It's very difficult. They're more built for dragging heavy things, and also in this climate, I guess it makes less sense to squat, and because you're gonna freeze there. So this is, and you see the squat in warm climates, and it's like so open and accessible.